1980s Tour de France bikes against 2026 Tour de France bikes. Which one is actually better, not prettier, not more nostalgic, faster? Same roads, same climbs, same finish line in Paris. Maybe one of them is hanging in your garage right now. A steel frame, a shift lever bolted to the down tube, the bike your dad rode, or the one you keep swearing you'll restore. Here is what nobody in a bike shop will tell you. The old one weighs just under 20 pounds. It shifts with your fingertips and a little bit of faith. It cost a few weeks of wages once. The new one is not allowed to weigh less than 6.8 kilograms. A rule stops it. It shifts with a microchip and a battery. The version Tadej Podgar rode costs more than 16,000 euros. So the modern bike wins, obviously. Lighter, stiffer electronic aero, except for one number that refuses to line up. The closest Tour de France ever won 8 seconds after more than 3,000 kilometers of racing was won on the old steel bike. And that winning margin did not come from the frame. It came from a part that cost about $200. That is the hard truth this whole video is about. So let's actually settle it. Start with the thing almost every rider now takes for granted. Newer is faster. And the reason newer is faster is the machine underneath you. And honestly, it looks airtight. Look at the numbers. The 2026 Tour de France was the fastest in the history of the race. The peloton averaged 43.3 kilometers per hour for 3 weeks. Podgar won his 5th yellow jersey and joined Merckx, Hinault, Indurain, and Anquetil in the record books. Now rewind to 1989. Greg LeMond won that tour at an average of 37.5 kilometers per hour. Same race, same mountains, almost 6 kilometers per hour slower. 6 kilometers per hour across a whole tour is an enormous gap. And the easy story says the bike closed it. Carbon instead of steel. 12-speed electronic instead of 6-speed friction. Disc brakes instead of rim. Deep aero wheels. A power meter counting every watt. That story is not wrong. That is what makes it dangerous. Because before you hand it the win, you have to actually look at what the old bike was, not the romance of it, the engineering of it. A professional racing bike in the 1980s was steel, and usually one of 2 tube sets. Reynolds 531 out of England or Columbus out of Italy, brazed together by a person with a torch, one joint at a time. The finishing kit, if you were at the top, was Campagnolo Super Record, a rear derailleur with titanium bolts, brake calipers that were beautiful and frankly only okay at stopping, a 6-speed freewheel on the back, 2 chain rings up front, 12 gear ratios total. Today a single cassette gives you 12. And the shifting. The shifting is the part younger riders cannot believe. The levers were on the down tube between your legs. To change gear, you took a hand off the bars, reached down, and moved a lever by feel, with no click to tell you it had worked. You learned to trim it mid-pedal stroke. You learned to guess. A complete bike like that, Columbus tubing, full Super Record, came in at just under 20 pounds, around 9 kilograms, hand-built, race-ready, and a full 2 kilograms heavier than what the pros roll out today. So yes, the old bike was slower to shift, worse in the wet, draggier in the wind, heavier on the climb. All of that is true, and all of it is why the assumption feels obvious. Here is the flaw in the assumption. It has been sitting in plain sight since 1989, and almost nobody says it out loud. The frame was never the thing that made you slow. This is the moment to subscribe, because the 8 seconds I'm about to walk you through quietly dismantle almost everything 100 years of frame marketing has told you, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in a bike shop again. That should have been the end of the story. Steel got old, carbon got faster, everyone moved on. But this is where 1989 steps in and ruins the tidy version. To understand why 1989 matters, you have to know how close it came to never happening. Greg LeMond became the first American to ever win the Tour de France in 1986. He was 25, the strongest rider in the world, and the sport belonged to him. 8 months later, on the 20th of April 1987, he was turkey hunting in Northern California when his brother-in-law, not knowing where he was crouched, fired through a bush. Around 30 shotgun pellets tore into his body, 2 of them lodged in the lining of his heart. A lung collapsed. He lost close to 2/3 of his blood on the ground, waiting for a police helicopter that happened to be minutes away. Surgeons pulled buckshot out of his liver, his kidneys, his intestines. He nearly died in a field. 2 of those pellets are still inside him, next to his heart to this day. He lost almost 2 full seasons. The peloton wrote him off. A comeback was supposed to be a sentimental thing that faded on the first mountain, and picture the world he was coming back to. Tires were tubulars glued onto the rims by hand, and if you punctured, you rode on the glue and prayed. Most riders still strapped their feet in with toe clips and leather straps. On their heads, if anything, a padded leather hairnet that would embarrass a modern skateboarder. Wool jerseys that weighed a pound when it rained. Steel everywhere you looked. This was not some lost golden age of technology. It was hard, heavy, and unforgiving, which is exactly what makes what happened next so strange. In 1989, Le Mans arrived at the final day of the Tour, trailing Laurent Fignon, the Frenchman with the ponytail and the round glasses, by 50 seconds. The stage was a time trial, 24.5 kilometers from Versailles into the heart of Paris, finishing on the Champs-Élysées. 50 seconds over 24 kilometers was not a lead, it was a fortress. Le Mans rode a steel Bottecchia, same era, same materials, same weight class as the bike we just took apart. But onto the bars, he clipped something the peloton had openly mocked. Aerobars, Scott clip-on extensions lifted straight from triathlon that let him stretch his arms out front and drop his head. He wore a smooth teardrop helmet. Fignon wore his hair loose, hands on old bullhorn bars, and no aero helmet at all. Le Mans covered those 24.5 kilometers at 54.5 kilometers an hour, the fastest time trial the Tour had ever seen to that point. He took 58 seconds out of Fignon in a single afternoon. He erased the 50-second deficit and won the Tour de France by 8 seconds. It is still, all these years later, the closest finish the race has ever had. Fignon crossed the line, was told the margin, and sank onto the tarmac of the Champs-Élysées with his head in his hands. 50 seconds up in the morning, 8 seconds down by evening. Cycling folklore has it that his loose ponytail, flapping in the wind, cost him drag he could not afford, that a haircut might have saved the 8 seconds. Fold that in with the Aerobars he refused and the helmet he never wore, and the pattern is impossible to miss. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Those clip-on bars cost about $200. Wind tunnel testing since has measured their benefit at roughly 10% less drag at that speed, worth 60 to 70 seconds over that distance. Fignon lost by 8. Same frames, same steel, same weight. The whole Tour de France was decided by a $200 accessory that changed the shape of the man in the wind, not by one single thing about the bicycle underneath him. And it was not a fluke of one race. Look at what genuinely changed the sport in that era. 1984, Shimano put index shifting on its Dura Ace group, the click that finally told your fingers the gear had landed. No more guessing. 1985, Bernard Hinault won the Tour on look clipless pedals, borrowed from ski bindings that locked your foot to the crank. Every leap that decade that actually made riders faster bolted onto the bike or onto the rider. The shifting, the pedals, the position in the wind, not one of them was the frame. The frame stayed steel and stayed roughly the same weight for the entire 10 years. Go back further, and the point only sharpens. In 1972, Eddie Merckx set the world hour record in Mexico City, 49.4 kilometers in 60 minutes on a steel Colnago. That record was in his lungs, not his tubing. 50 years later, the tubing is unrecognizable and the lesson has not changed a word. Even that record proved the point twice over. When Francesco Moser finally beat Merckx in 1984, he did it with disc wheels and a streamlined machine, not with stronger legs. The technology escalated so far that in the year 2000, the governing body wiped the slate clean and reset the hour record all the way back to Merckx's 1972 ride on standard equipment, the same instinct that would freeze bike weight at 6.8 kilograms. Whenever the equipment starts deciding the race, the sport quietly rules it back out, because everyone deep down knows the machine was never supposed to be the point, so the frame was never the deciding factor. And yet every launch, every catalog, every glossy advert since points you straight back at it. There is a reason for that, and it is not engineering. Follow the incentives. They explain the timeline far better than the physics does. Step 1. By the late 1990s, carbon had a problem. The industry never puts on a poster. Frames had become too good. Builders could make one so light it was genuinely unsafe under a sprinting professional. In the year 2000, cycling's governing body drew a line in the rulebook. No race bike could weigh less than 6.8 kilograms. That number, written into the Lugano Charter in 1996 and enforced from 2000, is still the law today. Read what that actually did. For 25 years, the one spec riders obsess over most, weight, has been frozen by regulation. You are not allowed to sell a lighter bike than the rules permit. Lightness became free, and on the very same day, it fell off the table as a thing anyone could charge you for. Step 2. What do you sell when you cannot sell lightness? You sell everything wrapped around it. Aerodynamics, electronic shifting, disc brakes, integration, cables buried inside the frame, cockpits molded into one piece, every standard made proprietary. This is the era that gave us the phrase marginal gains. Teams chasing half a watt in a wind tunnel, skin suits with textured sleeves, helmets shaped like teardrops, socks trimmed to a regulated height. Notice what every bit of it targets. Air, the rider's shape in the wind, the exact thing a $200 set of clip-ons found on a steel bike in 1989. The industry did not discover a new secret. It industrialized Le Mans, wrapped a carbon frame around it, and sold you the frame. Step 3. And every one of those upgrades pried open a replacement cycle that never quite closes. Disc brakes meant your rim brake wheels were now worthless. Buy new ones, $3,000 and up for the good carbon. Through axles meant your old frame standard was dead. Bottom bracket standards changed, then changed again. Electronic shifting meant a battery, a charger, an app, and a rear derailleur you cannot fix with a hex key at the roadside. One 50-gram cable vanished, and a whole ecosystem of parts you had already paid for quietly expired. Now be very clear about one thing, because this is exactly where people lose their minds on both sides of it. None of this means the technology is a con. The modern bike is genuinely faster. Disc brakes genuinely stop better in the rain. Electronic shifting genuinely never misses a gear. That is the trap. Deciding that because you are being sold something, it must be a lie. It is not a lie. It is real, and it is oversold at the very same time. Both of those things are true, and holding both at once is the only honest place to stand. So let's do the accounting properly. Both directions, no filter. Here is what the 1980s bike really costs you. 1. It shifts slower and in a bunch sprint or a fast technical descent that costs you position, and position is the race. 2. Those gorgeous Campagnolo calipers turn genuinely frightening in the wet with real measurable extra stopping distance on a steel rim in the rain. 3. You give away watts to the wind and kilos to the mountain every second you ride, and stretched over 4 hours that stops being charming and starts being time on the clock. Here is what the 2026 bike really costs you. 1. Money, and not a little of it. Podgar's Colnago retails north of 16,000 euros. A Pinarello Dogma sits around 15,000. A top Specialized runs close to 12,000 pounds. The frame on its own can be 5,000 before you have bought a single wheel. 2. Dependence and fragility. Flat battery, no shifting. A crash that cracks integrated carbon can write off a bike that a steel frame would have shrugged off and ridden home, and a steel frame from 1985 can still be repaired by any frame builder alive, while a cracked carbon cockpit from a few years ago is often simply unsupported and gone. 3. And the quiet one, the one the launch video will never say. It will not make you fast. That 43 kilometers per hour Peloton is not fast because of its frames. In 2005, the Tour was won at 41.7 by Lance Armstrong, a result later struck from the record books. In 2022, Jonas Vingegaard pushed it past 42. In 2026, Podgar took it to 43.3, the fastest ever. That curve is not carbon. Look at what actually got faster. Riders now eat on the bike like scientists, up to 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour, 600 calories, where Le Mans' generation nibbled a jam sandwich and hoped. Every effort is measured by a power meter his era did not have. The training is a different sport. The frames are lighter and slipperier, yes, but the Peloton climbing at 43 kilometers per hour is climbing on lungs and legs and fuel, not on a purchase order. Buy the exact bike Podgar rides, and you will still be precisely as fast as your own legs, minus 16,000 euros. Here is the honest verdict, and like most honest verdicts in cycling, it flatly refuses to be simple. If you ride for the feeling of it, for the ride itself, for the clean click of a downtube lever, for a frame a human being brazed by hand, for quietly keeping pace with people who spent 10 times what you did, then the 1980s bike is not a compromise. It is the better buy, and it is not even close. You get around 90% of the real-world speed, all of the soul, and you keep $15,000 in your pocket. If you actually race, if you are pinning on a number descending in the wet at 50 an hour, sitting in a bunch where one missed shift ends your day, then the modern bike is not vanity. There, the marginal gains are the whole margin, and you should buy it and use every last gram of what it gives you. And if you want most of that with none of the 16,000 euros, a 5-year-old carbon bike with electronic shifting and discs, bought used, gives you 95% of the current one for a third of the price. The bleeding edge is the worst value on the shelf every single year, and there is a reason a well-kept 1980s frame still sells briskly today, 40 years on. Steel does not delaminate, it bends before it breaks, and it can be cold set, rebrazed and repainted by a builder in an afternoon. A good one was bought once from a local shop after months of saving, and it was meant to last a lifetime, and plenty of them have. That is a kind of value no depreciation curve on a carbon superbike will ever touch. Which is exactly why the last question of this video is the one that actually costs people money. The criterion is that clean. The question was never which bike is better. The question is which one you are actually going to do something with. The machine only ever matters as much as the use you put it to. So before you spend $16,000 on speed, run the cheaper experiment. $200 on a proper bike fit and a few sessions learning to hold a low aero position. Nothing at all on eating and training like you mean it. Do that first, then, and only then, decide whether the frame was ever really the problem. For almost everyone watching this, it was not. And that is the one thing the entire industry needs you to forget, because here is where we started. The fastest tour in history. 2026, 43 kilometers per hour, 16,000 euro machines won by the strongest man in the race, not the most expensive bicycle in it. And the closest tour in history, 1989, settled by 8 seconds, won on a steel bike your father could have bought, by a man with 2 pellets in his heart who spent $200 to change his shape in the wind, 37 years apart. Opposite ends of the technology, exactly the same lesson, both times. The road never once checked your frame, it only ever checked your legs. The bike got faster. The truth about what makes a rider fast has not moved a single inch. If this settled something for you, the next one almost writes itself, because not all of that old steel is worth saving. Some of it is the best value in all of cycling, and some of it belongs in a skip. I break down exactly which vintage steel road bikes last forever, and the 4 that belong in the trash, in the video showing on your screen right now. It is the perfect other half of this same story. Click it, and I'll see you inside.